people want to know, well, how do I get through medical school? Well, that scholarship still exists. If you get accepted to a medical school, you apply for the scholarship and you get a service obligation, just like being in the Army. And actually, I kind of used it for my benefit because my pay stub would come out and it would say second lieutenant commissioned. And so I went to USAA and got some cheap insurance. So uh, I paid back my service obligation in my old neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan, one of my old neighborhoods. And if you had told me 28 years ago that I was coming to Flint, Michigan, and that would be the longest I've ever lived in one city and in one house, and have all my children, 4 children, educated in Flint, I would have laughed at you. Because as far as I was concerned, in Detroit, Flint was that sign on I-75 at 8 Mile. You know, the arrow points up. Okay. And so, but nonetheless, I heard about Hurley Hospital through the Meharry physicians because at that time there was a strong pipeline of African American physicians coming from Meharry. Actually, there were a few folks from Howard who preceded them in the 50s. And so I heard about Hurley, and so I came for a position, didn't get it, but worked at Mott Children's Health Center. Then I went back to federally qualified health centers, Hamilton. And so I tell you all this because I've been in community pediatrics, not academic pediatrics, not university centers, and I've never been a hospital employee. So I have a different viewpoint that may be complementary to public health, but it is not the same data-driven process. I also like to share with people some history since I saw the Juneteenth parade on the way here. Uh, my mother is a graduate of Lincoln School for Nursing in Harlem, New York. I was born in Jamaica, New York. Not Jamaica the island, but Jamaica, New York. So she went to Lincoln. Lincoln started off as a uh, senior home for freed enslaved Africans in New York City because in between 1830s and 1840s, New York had a gradual manumission or freedom program, and so they had these elderly enslaved, formerly enslaved Africans who the Episcopal Church took care of. So it went from a old folks home to a nursing school and affiliated with Harlem Hospital. So there's a lot of history, and I can tell you about Howard. The Howard was named after a Civil War general, Oliver O. Howard, and he was instrumental in the Freedmen's Bureau. And he ran the camps, the refugee camps for escaped enslaved folks during the Civil War, and they became the Freedmen's Camp. Then they built a hospital in D.C. called Freedmen's Hospital, and Howard University around it, and the medical school. And so, you know, they closed Freedmen's Hospital the year I started medical school in 1974.
Wow.
And I share that so that we know that the past is not that far behind. Now, about Freedmen's Hospital, well, let's talk about the Freedmen's Refugee Camps. It was one of the largest public health emergencies in United States history. As the Civil War wound up and more refugees came around Arlington, Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia, there was an outbreak of smallpox in those refugee camps. And that's where Howard University Medical School got started because Some folks said, well, we need some doctors to take care of these folks.
Mhm.
But there were also people in D.C. who said formerly enslaved Africans cannot live free.
Mm.
And maybe we should just let them die of smallpox because they just can't survive without being enslaved.
Mm.
So that smallpox epidemic spread throughout the South, because remember, the South was devastated after the Civil War.
Mhm.
Okay? Now, that was late 1860s, right?
Mhm.
Well, we know about the Buffalo Soldiers, but what we don't hear about is how smallpox spread out west. The United States Army took smallpox infected blankets out to the Native American lands. So you see how history ties things
Mhm.
together. Okay? And that will give you a snapshot of the problems and the challenges that we have from a health aspect. And then we can talk about, yes, there was the Tuskegee experiment,
Mhm.
where a group of black men, even after the discovery of the cure for syphilis, penicillin, were not treated. Well, 2 years after President Carter apologized for the syphilis experiment, I had to take my little self down to Tuskegee VA Hospital for a summer job, and there I was. Now, you know how things are in the United States. If it happened 2 weeks ago, we forget about it. But I just wanted to check things out for myself.
Mhm.
And that's where I heard about Hurley Hospital. And that's what made me say, after about 8 years of practice in my Detroit area, I said, well, let me come check out Flint. So here I am. And then there's also another historic part about Flint. 5 years before the Flint water crisis jumped off, I read this book, in The Environmental Crisis, by uh, U of M PhD, sociology, public health, by the name of Bunyan Bryant. Dr. Bunyan Bryant was born and raised in Flint, Michigan. He's a brother. Let me
Mhm.
make this clear. He has multiple degrees. He went to U of M and he helped formulate the environmental justice approach. And he's written several books. And in the midst of the Flint water crisis, I had an opportunity to personally meet him. And what many folks don't know is he was an instructor of Dr. Mona Hanna Atisha and a few of us who were involved in, from the medical and public health aspect, in the Flint water crisis. But that was a Flint born and raised person, and if I remember correctly, he went to Northern High School. I shouldn't say that right next to Northwestern, should I? But I said it. So I just happened to pick up that book. I'll say it that way, even though I don't mean to. It was providential. And I read the book, but what I'd like to share with you all tonight is his uh, 8 arguments that he responds to when people say, well, we can't do environmental justice, it's just too difficult. And since I have Father Scheid back here, don't you all have this system you call apologetics? Well, I'm going to give you Dr. Bunyan Bryant's apologetics or justifications for uh, environmental justice. Now, does anybody have their own working definition of environmental justice? Just take a guess. Okay, that that is that is the first part, without a doubt. Okay, uh, and then it goes beyond that. Uh, well, let's talk about there's protecting the environment. There's protecting the flowers, the fauna, the people, and the animals. I'll throw that in there in the environment. And some people are more protected by it than others. Some people bear a greater burden of the negative aspect. All right, of environment, of any environment, any project or economic development that has an effect on the environment. So you know how sometimes people will, if one of our Native American brothers or sisters starts speaking about the creation, the Creator, and how we are one with the environment, and they'll talk about, some people will talk about Mother Earth,
Mm-hmm.
and folks will roll their eyes and say this is mysticism, this is just some stuff. Okay, when in fact, if you look at the nations that exist within Michigan, they look at their quality of life in relation to the environment. And so there's certain activities that are traditional and tied to their culture and based on their traditional knowledge that make them value the wild rice that grows in the wetlands in the middle of Michigan very much. And they see anything that would damage that wildlife harvest as damaging to their way of life, to themselves, and disrespectful to the creation. I was part of the environmental justice work group that the governor reluctantly convened to address the issues of environmental injustice. And we did a tour of about 3 or 4 sites in Michigan. And one of the places we went to was Traverse City. And Traverse City is booming. Everybody says, "Oh, that's the place to go." And they had just built a condo complex next to this cold water stream. And of course, it was air conditioned. And of course, you have to have a cooling tower to cool the water. And they diverted water from a stream into the cooling tower and heated up the water. Well, that destroyed a cold water species of trout that grew up there, that was a food source for many people who lived up there. Okay, and then they pointed out the Enbridge number 5 pipeline. Okay, and you heard about it being smashed this winter by a tanker, and the big fear is that that pipeline will rupture because it's 65 years old. Well, 60% of the food fish consumed by the nations that live in that part of Michigan under and by treaty rights, 60% of the fish they consume come from that area, the Straits of Mackinac. So a ruptured pipeline would be disastrous, not just to the fish, which is bad enough, but to a way of life and to the connection that those folks feel when it's the little band of Grand Traverse. Well, that pipeline runs along the eastern part of the lower peninsula, comes all the way down to Port Huron, crosses over to Sarnia, and there's a huge oil refinery there. And there's also a couple of islands south of the bridge that are First Nation, as they call them in Canada, uh, areas, territory. And they've noticed over the years that there's an imbalance between the number of females being born and the number of males. And the concern is there are chemicals being released into the environment that are reducing the number of males that are born on that island. So, we're not talking about oh, and that brings up an excellent point because the scientists will always the scientists who work for the chemical companies will always say, well, that's a correlation. That's something that seems to happen in association, but that doesn't mean it's the cause thereof, which comes to the whole point of the precautionary principle, which is essentially, we might call it common sense. But why would you risk releasing something into the environment that would cause an irreversible change? Aha, exactly. So, what is what is the purpose of our being here? Now, if you look at the Michigan Constitution, in one of the earlier clauses, it says it is the responsibility of the Michigan legislature to protect the environment and the public health. Are we living up? And that's the Constitution, I think it's of 1963, not 1863, 1963. And how many of the people that we've elected actually pay attention to that? It's also the responsibility of the governor to make sure that people are treated fairly and equitably. There's another clause of the Constitution that requires that there be a civil rights commission to ensure that this was carried out. And that's why the Michigan Civil Rights Commission came during the water crisis down here to uh, review what happened. And their summation was basically that there is a long, ongoing practice of policy and, and practices that are based on institutional racism, systemic racism. And you might also add class on there too, because if you go to some of the rural counties that are mostly white, you will see they have their problems with chemical contamination also. You may have read about the PFAS contamination in St. Louis, Michigan. If a big company comes to a rural county and says, we want to develop, give you some development and jobs, they, Wolverine had a plant there. This chemical was part of a water repellent for shoes. And it got into the ground and the groundwater. Well, after they shut that plant down years ago, next development project is the factory farm that put out as much fecal matter crap as an urban population of 100,000 people. And that gets into the flowing waters in the area. And if you look in southern Michigan, it flows from, about Coldwater or where I-69 goes south through those waters into Lake Erie. And all that fecal matter and fertilizer gets into Lake Erie just north of Toledo and causes algae bloom. So they have an ongoing water crisis in Toledo, Ohio, due to this economic development. So I will state the obvious. What do you need every day, and then what do you need every moment? You need air. You might live 2 minutes without appropriate oxygen. And you need, by the end of the day, you're going to need some water. Okay? And so we are surrounded by 90% of the world's fresh water, and we are destroying that source. And then it gets worse, because then we get into environmental injustice, environmental racism, and then denying folks access to the essentials for life by dealing, using water as a source of revenue for a city or a county. So in other words, if you can't cover the cost of water service, you can't provide water to people. And that's what's going on here. Now think about that. Here we are in the United States of America. We can build an Air Force base in Iraq in a matter of months. We can, as people always say, we can send a man to the moon. We can send a satellite as far as we wish into the universe to look at Mars and whatever other planet there is. But we can't provide fresh, clean, affordable water, safe water to children and adults. So then we get into my subspecialty. I'm a pediatrician. Okay, little children are about 60% water, maybe as much as 75% on the first day. They're like little bags of water. So for the first 6 months of life, we as pediatricians tell mothers you should exclusively breastfeed or formula feed. So mom's drinking water from the faucet. Moms also, you know how we used to when we're mixing formula. Well, why mix cold water with formula when I got to feed this baby at 3 in the morning? Why don't we use lukewarm water so it'll be more acceptable to the baby? So, but the lukewarm water, especially in lead contaminated water, increases the amount of lead, that's soluble lead, plus the lead flakes that break off from pipes. So, you know, I haven't figured out the difference between being exposed to lead and being poisoned by lead. But I think that if you drink lead tainted water and you ingest it and your body absorbs it, you have been poisoned. And there is no safe amount of lead. Period. So, once again, certain researchers will say, well, you have to prove that lead caused these problems. Okay? I'm from the East Coast, and one of my mother's jobs was to be a public health nurse who would first go to the schools and find out the children who were having health problems, and then go to the home and see what was going on. And that was back in the early 50s. You remember Freddie Gray in Baltimore? He was a lead exposed child. His family collected money from a lawsuit due to lead exposure during I will say, an improperly administered research on, shall we be, lead abatement, in other words, cover up the lead, or lead removal in homes in Baltimore. And so people will say to me, well, that doesn't explain Freddie Gray's whole life. But you see, besides the attention deficit disorder problem, the behavioral regulation problem, uh, besides the problem solving issues, being able to do math, reading, and remember vocabulary, well, it also caused, well, let's say, less than stellar academic records. And so Freddie Gray, like many brothers in his neighborhood, were hanging on the point. And that led to his interaction with the criminal justice system. And if you look, All right. If you look, you will see that in communities that have lead problems, they also have violent crime problems. They also have homicide problems. It's also related to imprisonment. It's related to high unemployment. So the certain scientists will say, "Oh, that's just a correlation. That's not caused by lead." Okay, but you see this play over and over again. Then you look in another community, and in another community, uh, that lead exposure is not tolerated. So, and it's lead, mercury, arsenic, air pollution, and as part of the environmental justice work group, we went to Southwest Detroit. Anybody familiar with that area? Uh, I see one of my fellow almost homeboys over there who's from Detroit, right? Southwest Detroit. On the one side, it's the river, the Detroit River. Along the river, there was U.S. Steel. There was the Detroit Sewage Incinerator. There's the Rouge River. Anybody ever hear of Ford Rouge, or the Ford Assembly Complex that had a coke and a steel uh, plant there? That's to the north, on the other side of I-75. There's Marathon Oil. There's the highly contaminated Rouge River. Uh, there are several other iron and incinerators in that area. Now, in that area, there are also four cities. They are predominantly African American and or low income and working class. Four cities. What we found out in our tour is if the marathon plant in Detroit has a problem, they might tell the city of Detroit. But there's no way to tell the people who live in the other three cities, Ecorse, Melvindale, I always forget the fourth one. Hmm? Southgate, okay, that there's been a air quality emergency or an emission of poisonous gases. So the people in one town may know, and you will, if you know anything about Detroit, the southwest corner of Detroit, I'd say the north border is the Ambassador Bridge, that great international border crossing where uh, hundreds of trucks come across every day. Well, there's what we call Mexican Village area there, and then as you move further south, a large African American population in Delray. But if you also look, there are railroad tracks, two major trunk lines that are going to the barges at the border or going to the refinery. And we sat there for 1 hour one day and watched tank car after tank car on the railroad pass by. And the residents would tell us sometimes those trains stop and block the emergency access. So if they call an ambulance, it can't get around them because those cars are so long. Then you have the tanker trucks coming from the refinery, carrying flammable or poisonous materials from the refinery or to the refinery. And so if one of them explodes, how do you get out? Okay, and then you have schools. They actually showed us two sites where Detroit public schools had been closed because they discovered they were built on contaminated land. And so when we talk about environmental justice and bring these things up, it's like, oh well, that's where they chose to live. And when it's time to expand a refinery or a steel plant or an incinerator, they say, well, that's where we should put them because the land is cheap, and nobody complains, and it's economic development, and we provide jobs. Predominantly working class and or low income, bearing the burden of refining oil for the region, bearing the burden of making steel for the region while it compromises their health. And my stepdad was a Ford Rouge Steel employee, and I would go pick him up sometimes, and you could watch the black soot blow across the parking lot. And if you think Buick City is big, Ford Rouge was huge. But what I did notice when I go pick him up is the cars in the lot were either covered, and a good number of the cars that weren't covered, the air ate the paint off their vehicles. And if you know about that area, well, yes, there's Mexican Village to the north. There's the African American, predominantly African American community between I-75 and River, and Delray, and Ecorse. There's a large Middle Eastern, that's nowhere, Arabic-speaking population in Dearborn, just to the northwest of the Ford Rouge plant. And it's curious that we all have the same issues. Why are these plants that emit soot and dust, particulate matter, and that pollute the ground and water surrounding communities of color? And that is the essence of environmental injustice. And what we found out was, well, Detroiters always know about the higher incidence of asthma in that part of town. It has been persistent, and yes, you should not smoke. Okay, that can be a problem. But it hasn't been until the last 20 years where people in those communities have been saying, well, yes, but you shouldn't have all these emissions, either gas, particulate matter, or other chemical exposures that cause breathing problems for our children and adults in that area. The point I'm getting to is I've practiced pediatrics since 1982 in two communities, and I hear people talk about infant mortality being higher in communities of color. I hear people talking about asthma being a problem. I hear about behavioral problems, but we are living in a community where exposures to chemicals due to economic activity, man-made activity, are allowing us to be sick. So now we've gone from environmental justice and injustice to environmental racism to environmental health. Now, back in the day, it was discovered, well, actually, they knew in Rome that lead was a poison. And they used to build these huge aqueducts that carried the water from wherever the water source was in the mountains to Rome. And they were lead lined. And there's some people hypothesize that continuous low level exposure to lead affected the development and the behavior of residents of Rome and led to the decline of Rome. Well, it's not new. In the 1800s, they discovered that lead could cause an abortion. So there were women who did not want to have a child who would consume lead to induce an abortion. Then we know that lead causes low birth weight, and prematurity, just like alcohol, tobacco smoke, and air pollution. We know that air pollution causes heart attacks, circulatory disease. It causes inflammation of the blood vessels. And so here we have communities that bear a disproportionate burden. So as we went to talk to the industry when we did this environmental justice work group, and we talked to the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, number one, we asked them, have you ever turned down a permit because you know it's affecting the health of a community? Have you ever turned down, well, they said we probably did that. Have you ever turned down a permit where you know that there's a community that has cumulative impact? The air, the water. Have you heard of vapor intrusion? That's underground chemical contamination. So let me tell you what we discovered about that as part of the work group. We went to Grand Rapids, and Grand Rapids is booming. Folks can't even find decent, affordable housing now because the price of rents are going up, and there's some old parts of the city. So our first stop was a nonprofit. They had redone the office and it was beautiful, but in the remodeling, they left some opening in the basement floor as they removed posts as they modified the floor support. They did not know that where the beautiful apartment building next door was built, it was also the site of a dry cleaner. And for decades, the dry cleaner dumped his solvent into a hole in the ground. So those solvents over decades moved underground, and the vapor moved underground to that newly remodeled nonprofit community organization. And the vapor rose up through the floor. So MGEQ comes in and they do their measurements in January. That had to be about 2 years ago. Then they came back one morning, or the county health department came back one morning as soon as the building opened and told the director and the staff, you must leave this building immediately. It's an emergency because you have vapors coming up from the ground that are potentially cancerous. So imagine an employer who has pregnant women, people with breathing problems in the building, and people who don't know how this affects them. And so his first question was, well, what took you so long? You were here in January. Why did it take you so long till June? Does this story sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so the DEQ guy who was on the bus as we drove around Grand Rapids touring, he said to us, well, we only have 4 vapor intrusion inspectors in the state of Michigan. And if 2 of them are on vacation, or one is on vacation and one is on sick leave, we only have 2. And they have, I forget how many hundreds of sites that they actually have to inspect and regulate. So once again, we have an economic activity that was unregulated. We have an agency that has had budget cuts that can't do its job to protect the health of people. So then let's get to Flint. In Flint, well, in that situation, the DEQ was in charge of water, safe water. They call it the Safe Water Drinking Program. That had been taken out of Health and Human Services. Our governor, who wanted to run this state more efficiently because he's one smart nerd, merged the Department of Community Health, the Department of Health and Human Services, and Social Services into one organization.
Mm.
and pulled safe drinking water out of health and human services.
Mm.
So while GEQ was approving all the things that led to the Flint water crisis, no one within those agencies spoke up about the threat to health. Actually, they told us, oh, you can't get enough problems from drinking water. It's dust and paint chips.
Mm.
And then when the Legionella became a problem, they said, oh, you can't get Legionnaire's disease from consuming municipal water. And see, all that's based on information from 30, 40 years ago. Because, well, even 50 years ago, the biggest problem, and it still is lead paint,
Mhm.
dust, lead, eating lead paint chips. We call it Tycho. The kids do hand them out, and then they eat paint chips too, because
Mhm.
they're sweet. Okay, so they said it can't be water. You just can't get enough lead by drinking water. But remember, I told you, it is practice in the U.S. with feeding babies that you mix formula with water because it's easier to
Mhm.
carry that way. So we had infants who were drinking lead contaminated water, but no one would listen when that point was brought up, and no one in health and human services would acknowledge that blood lead levels were rising, and it was something that deserved further investigation. Nor did they have the staff to actually analyze the blood that was taken. Well, there's another problem, and that is typically we draw blood lead levels from finger sticks to the vein when a child is 9 to 12 months old for the first time. And we don't do a very good job at that. Maybe we get 60% of that at best. Okay. Well, blood lead levels tell you what your exposure was to lead in the past 28 to 35 days. If you tested, say, 2 months out, 60 days, it may be back down to normal. So you can say, well, nothing happened because if you have a 2 month old who's been drinking lead contaminated water from day one, and then he starts eating more or she starts eating more solid food after 6 months and consuming less formula, come 9 to 12 months, the lead level you see then is has nothing to do with consuming lead contaminated water. So pushing health and human services to see this is amazing. And then there was another problem. The head of health and human services evidently must be a very smart man because he graduated from Yale University, but he had his degree in economics. His degree was not in public health. The
Mm.
public health director, well, we used to have a surgeon general until Granholm left office,
Mhm.
and they discontinued that office. That was a cabinet level office. Who, if she saw something wrong, she'd wave the red flag to the governor.
Mhm.
Well, one smart nerd didn't do that. Okay, so there was no real full-time health person at a cabinet level talking to the governor or even the department head. The chief medical officer for the state of Michigan was a part-time position because our governor wanted to run Michigan like a corporation.
Mhm.
And he's relatively moderate compared to the others. Then there's the others who want small government. And you know how you get small government. You don't increase taxes. You don't charge fees for regulation. You don't enforce regulation. Now, how many people here have relatives from the South? Okay, I think you all remember what small government is all about. Small government was when we walked to school while others rode the bus.
Mhm. Mhm.
We did not go to the same school. In certain communities, be they black or brown, there was no library. You know, I was born up north, so my parents would tell me, okay, when you go down south, you look for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, you look for the rib joint, you look for the barber shop, you look for Booker T. Washington or George Washington Carver School, and you know that you're in the neighborhood.
Mhm.
This is essential knowledge when you travel back in those days. But what they didn't mention is, you also look for the drainage ditch. You look for the creek that was drainage for the community, and that was polluted water. And so, in many places, even up to the 1960s, when President Johnson started the war on poverty, you got your water from a pump in the backyard.
Mhm.
There was no indoor plumbing. And look, I'm only 66 years old. And I'm telling you what I'm familiar with, even in some rural places up north.
Mhm.
So, this environmental exposure is nothing new. And so you always hear about, uh, well, in communities of color, especially African American, the issue is high blood pressure and heart attacks. Well, you know what low level lead exposure over a long period of time can cause? High blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, gout. Anybody here ever have gout? Okay. It will make you call your mama, won't it?
Mhm.
Your big toe, usually it's big toes for a lot of people, gets red, swollen. You can't even lay a sheet on your
Mhm.
toe at night.
That's right.
Okay? Now, I knew nothing about it until I drank Flint water, telling my wife, oh no, they never do that. And she'd say, look, the water's brown. And I'd say, but look now, baby, the water's clear.
Mhm.
And so I drank Flint water. And it wasn't until recently, a year after, well, more than a year after exposure, that my indicators for gout came down and my clinical presentation of gout, the big red lump next to the big toe that
Mhm.
was tender to touch, just calmed down. And then they tell us, oh, there's another thing. Oh, community people are irrational, too emotional when you talk to them about environmental health issues. And they don't understand the complexity of all these interactions. And so, rations was a big issue, right?
Mhm.
We had to talk sternly and firmly to people from the federal agencies when they came and said, well, we want lead levels because we want to model how this exposure happened over time and how it would decrease. And we said, no, we want you to cut out the water that is the source of lead. And that battle went on for about 30 days till they just gave up because they thought we were being irrational. And then they said, well, it's only a lead problem. And we had to tell them, look, you don't know what was corroded in those pipes. And you can't say you know what happened in every neighborhood. And you can't say you know what happened in every household. Because
Mhm.
not only were the water mains, the lead service line uh, corroded, but also the indoor plumbing.
Mhm.
And there's lead in the solder in our pipes.
Mhm.
There was corrosion in our water heaters. And then you find out the so-called lead-free fixtures are actually, until recently, 3 to 8% lead. So when you go to a neighborhood school, like in my neighborhood, Freeman School, it has one of the highest lead levels in water coming out of a school water fountain than other schools in the city, and they say, "Oh well, these children, they just have all kinds of problems. Their academic performance is issues." But every morning, the first kid to drink from certain water fountains got a slug of lead every morning.
Mm.
Imagine that happens 2 or 3 times a week. And who told you all that you should flush water, your water when you come home from a vacation? Did anybody tell you that? Who told you that you should flush your water for 5 minutes, even in a healthy water system? Did anybody tell you that? Okay. And so, what does lead do to performance? Now, I've talked about IQ. IQ is not a good measure, but it has some limited usefulness, especially if you're talking about a particular population that has a similar set of factors, economic factors and social factors. You've heard of the bell curve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And at each end of the bell curve, there's a 3% tail. Okay. So at one end of the right end, if you're looking at it from your viewpoint, uh, well, the left end,
Mm.
that that IQ, that 3% population is typically is higher performing than the other 90% of the kids in that population.
Mm.
Now at the top of that hump, and I'll admit, in medical school, that's where I stayed. Just to this side of average, a little better than average, but that's average. Okay? But then to the far right of that curve, the lower performing 3%, kids who need special help in school.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a population or a community exposed to lead, that curve shifts. So under the tail that should be 3% with the higher performing children, that's shifted. So maybe now that's 2%. And then you look at the tail of the kids who have lower performance in school, that goes up to 4 or 5%. So the effect on a community, I can't predict to you which child will be part of that group at the lower performing end. Because we have seen it time and time again. And so you think, scientific researchers that we're all, objective. Another fallacy. Okay. Well, since I'm in the McCree Theater, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'll tell you another story. And I'm a Baptist Sunday school teacher, so I teach my story. Uh, there was a son of Jewish immigrants. His name is Herbert Needleman. His parents ran a pickle factory in Philly, just to use for people information. He became a MD and a PhD, and his specialty was child and adolescent psychiatry, more specifically neuropsychiatry. He studied the effects of lead on a population, and it was he who I got a chance to meet in the 80s, a few years after he published his first paper where he demonstrated this shift in the IQ curve, this increase in so-called criminal behavior and homicide in neighborhoods. Well, for homicide, he demonstrated that when we switched to lead-free gasoline, the amount of lead in the dust decreased and the murder rates went down. Now, Giuliani will have you think that it's because of his broken windows campaign and
Mm.
aggressive law enforcement that decreased crime in communities of color. No, it was less exposure to lead. And
Mm.
over the years, the lead levels in normal populations dropped precipitously because there was less lead in the soil around the houses, around the highways. Oh, and where do they place highways? usually
And
through.
on this foot.
Thank you, thank you. And all you have to do is look at Southwest Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
They have this constantly
Oh
do
man.
and Drew going all the time, and they'll say, "Well, we need to expand this international river crossing at the Detroit River so we can bring more truck traffic through," while they expose the communities of Mexican descent to more air pollution and
Mm-hmm.
run the traffic through Southwest Detroit. So there are all these factors, but Herbert Needleman published in about 1979 this first
Mm-hmm.
paper where he talked about the changes in behavior attached to lead levels in the community, the changes in IQ. The American Chemical Society brought out their hired guns, these researchers, and took him to court and charged him with all kinds of things. That he faked his results,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that he plagiarized, and they took him to court. And during that time, he could not publish or do research for 2 years. He just died. I think he was in his 90s. He just died this, well, July 2017. But he was vindicated. But I share this story with you so you get an idea of how vicious this campaign is if you challenge the notion that we all have equal exposure. And what's the famous saying? When I say it, uh, absence of proof is not proof of absence. These interactions are so complex and over a long period of time, you don't expect a 3-month-old to solve math problems the way you might expect a third grader to solve math problems. You don't expect a 4-year-old to read, for the most part, the way you would expect a fourth grader to read.
Mm-hmm.
But you see these consistent patterns of academic problems that are related to exposure, and lead is a contributor. That is not the sole contributor. And that comes back to the issue of cumulative impact. So when we said the DEQ, well, how do you measure the cumulative impact on a community? They said we have no regulation for that. We have no way of scoring that in the
Mm-hmm.
state of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, we can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And they were still saying this summer,
Mm-hmm.
this past summer. So,
Mm-hmm.
basically, you can't find what you can't measure. Then there's the whole issue of quantitative research versus qualitative. You have to show this direct association between increasing incidence, and if people tell you something, that doesn't count in that branch of science. We call it qualitative research. Now you take it to a deeper level, because there's always things our folks told us, and we say grandma said this or uncle said that, and they had no proof for what they said, but they made the association
Mm-hmm.
over a long period of observation. There's this thing called traditional knowledge, and everybody has it, but in the Western model, uh, where everything can be measured and you do a fixed experiment to find it out. That's the only way of knowing. And I learned a word reading Dr. Bunyan Bryant's book. It's called epistemology. Now we're getting into philosophy. And basically, epistemology, and you can throw this word off, folks. I don't know if you put it in Scrabble, but it's how you know what you know, how you know what you know is true or false. And then what do you do with what you know? Now, traditional knowledge, if you go back to that example I gave to you about the Native American nations in the middle of Michigan who are harvesting their rice, they know At a certain time of the year, the wild rice is ready to be harvested, and we ought to drift over that way. And they have a whole way of life that's organized around that. And even if it's just for a season, but that's important to who those people see themselves as. Meaning we all have those things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I see my friend Father Shide out there, 9:30 every Sunday. Rain, well, not rain, but in the cold. You know, that is an important part of the way he presents himself to the world. But you see, that's based on tradition and knowledge. But there are different ways of knowing, and they'll call us superstitious. But let me digress again. Anybody heard of George Washington Carver?
Oh,
He was a Christian mystic. And why did they call him a Christian mystic? Because he would say, God showed me how to listen, understand, and talk to him. He was not just a peanut man. He was hired by Henry Ford to show how he could use soybeans to make plastics as well as paint and a few other things. Now, here is one of the greatest scientists, agronomists, agricultural scientists. People might chuckle about him, but he had so many patents. And the way he approached life was he did not hold those patents to make profits for himself. His goal was to show farmers how to make a living so that they could survive. He turned all those patents over to Tuskegee University, and that's why he's still here. But you see the kernel of the root of what he did was in that traditional knowledge. And here I go, ending up where I started. He was a premature baby, born of an enslaved African woman in Missouri. And his mom, I think she died. And he was raised by the owners. And he found a way to get to school. He went to the University of Iowa for postgraduate work. He did all kinds of things. And this is something that we have to get across to our children. That we can do anything. And we have many obstacles that we have to overcome. But we have a knowledge, regardless of what our ethnicity is, whatever our primary language is, we have a knowledge of understanding and understanding. And just because someone has a certain set of credentials, we're not telling folks to ignore them. What we're saying to folks is, okay, that is one way of knowing, but there are other ways of knowing that are of equal value. And so that is the essence of what happens in environmental injustice, where other ways of knowing, until they are backed up by the way of knowing that's predominant in the Western world, other ways of knowing are not valid. So I think I've run my mouth enough. Why don't we open the floor? Yes, sir.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier in your talk historically different demographics.
In small pox. Yes, sir.
Can you speculate on physical infections, mental health risks of children with patients in Texas right now? Because the closed borders coming with probably families without health care, without immunization, etc. Speculate.
Well, the most immediate thing is just the mental health problem. separated from the adults that care for you and being put in a cage. Okay, you've already uprooted that child from everything he or she knows. Excuse me if I get choked up. And you bring them to a place, well, through a journey that's terrifying. And you bring them to a place where their parents get snatched away and they get locked up. Okay, now, and that's related. You know, people say, oh, you know, that's just some emotional trauma. You'll get over it. Mm-mm. Well, you see, as the brain is fired by experience, what we see, what we do, it is wired. Mm-hmm. And trauma can rewire the brain. Mm-hmm. And so, negative experiences, we call them adverse childhood experiences. And see, my brother over here can talk about that for hours because, you know, we say, well, why does so and so have this health problem? Well, why won't they just cut loose that bottle? Or why do they have this substance use problem? Because there are experiences which have accumulated and have not been dealt with, and that adverse event follows through someone's life. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's irreparable. That's why when we talk about the things we have to do to fight lead exposure, basically they're the same things that we're going to have to do for those families where the children were separated from their parents and locked up. Uh, it's it it is easy, and we have to say it's wrong.
It's a lot of trauma.
Oh yes, oh yes, and you know I remember when we had a president who wanted to bomb Iraq, and you know the build-up came to we were going to bomb those weapons of mass destruction, and everybody was getting excited. And a news reporter approached me in the U of M pavilion and said, "Well, how do you feel about Iraq being bombed?" And I said, "Well, wait a minute. I'm a pediatrician, so you're talking to me about bombing children and their families, and I'm supposed to support that? It's pretty much the same thing." Mm-hmm. That's all I can say right now. Yes. Funny you should bring that up. The fish consumption guidelines that where you should only consume so much of a certain type of fish per week, those were pushed through. Many people don't know this by the work of the Genesee County Medical Society, and they actually had guides that were updated. And you know, all I know is catfish. But certain species of fish, because of their habitat and what they consume, have higher levels of chemicals than others. And that could be lead, mercury, arsenic, and a whole bunch of other organic compounds. There are supposed to be posted fish advisories. Okay, now, you know, as Dr. Rutherford would tell you, everybody fished in the Detroit River.
Oh yeah.
You know, there was like hustle, right? There were the brothers who fished and would go through the neighborhood and sell the fish. Mm-hmm. And because we didn't know any better or couldn't do any better, you know, that fish was purchased. Mm-hmm. Why do they allow it? Because they wouldn't allow it in other neighborhoods. First of all, they wouldn't allow those contaminants to remain in the water and the soil under the water. Mm-hmm. It's that goes back to environmental injustice. The quality of life and the quality of your food and your environment are neglected because, so I'll say it quite frankly, institutional racism. Mm-hmm. folks are not respected because of the way they look and the way they speak. So that's the best answer I can give you. And that's what makes the work of Bunyan Bryant so important. Another thing that I found perplexing is we had the lead problem in Flint. When you look at our education system, what schools had projects to take advantage of that so that students in Flint in science classes would get a deeper understanding of what was going on? I watched the news and I saw things going on in Grand Blanc and communities surrounding Flint, but I did not see this. And science is not cool, right? Or it's not seen as cool in some communities. And we have to work to change that because science properly applied can save our lives. Well, any other comments, questions?
Well, I noticed when before I came up here,
Mm-hmm.
I walked 5.7 tenths miles
Mm-hmm.
around Dallas. That's that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I walk every other day. And I come up here after I married my wife,
Mm-hmm.
and I begin to drink plenty of water.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had very downfall situations where my system was was messed up.
Mm-hmm.
I had triple bypass surgery.
Mm-hmm.
Then I had got gout.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have that stuff without
When did you come up here?
2006.
And, well, the problem really blew up after 2014. But then
In
if you lived in
2011,
Detroit, if you don't mind, where did you live in Detroit?
I live on the east side of Detroit, over there by Connors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
By the
between
Chrysler plant.
yeah, between Connors and where the airport is.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes.
And I stayed over there in that area, and I tell you, uh, there was some things that was going on there. Sometimes you wake up with brown water in
Mm-hmm.
the tap, you
Mm-hmm.
know. But I run the water for a while, and water clears up.
So let me start with the air.
Mm-hmm.
You were just northwest of the Detroit incinerator that was built by Mayor Foley Young.
Right.
And that has been a regulatory issue from the moment it was proposed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, my wife is from Crans Wood. That's
Okay.
Ryan Road
Yeah,
and 7 Mile, Nevada.
I
That's
know
on
what
the
that
side
is.
also.
I know what that is.
During this Flint water investigation, I come across a class action lawsuit that started in the early 90s
Mm-hmm.
because there were lead smelters
Mm-hmm.
next to a coffee shop, a coffee processor. I guess that covered the smell,
Right. Right.
but they burned batteries and other lead-containing materials, and the dust blew into the yards in that neighborhood. There was a class action lawsuit that was won by the attorney. Of course, when I go to the neighborhood, as recently as 2 years ago, one of the neighbors said, "Well, I'm still waiting on that money."
Yeah, yeah, they still in.
Oh yeah.
How could you win and not see anything? Come on.
They
Yeah.
appeal.
An appeal,
Uh,
an appeal.
yes. And then the companies either declare bankruptcy
There you go.
or they move
Mm-hmm.
across the U.S.-Mexican border
They changed their name.
and do the same thing over there.
Mm-hmm.
So we export our misery.
Mm-hmm.
So we have been through all kinds of exposures, and it has been permitted. Even here in Flint, you remember the incinerator case? Here started in 1990 or 1992. That prayer center. Uh, almost to Bluebell Beach, where Father Schmitter and two nuns whose names I forget filed a suit with the EPA, and there were hearings, and the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality came, and here's the heartbreaker. They showed up with armed guards. DEQ had never done that for a meeting before. One of my colleagues who helped get the fish advisory happened to be white, and he's a physician, and he said he had to get back to his office. So they changed the schedule so he could testify immediately. But Brother Clack, who was a representative at that time, had to get back to Lansing for a vote, but they wouldn't allow him to testify, change the schedule and testify, so he had to leave. It took the EPA 26 years, that was 2 years ago, to issue a final report about what happened in that hearing. And this is no small thing, because people of color and working class and low income communities know that behind that thin veneer of "I'm here for your protection" is the threat of state sanctioned violence. Because in no other meeting in any other community was there an armed guard. And this was way before, 9/11. This, and it's this set of policies and practices based on how they view a community. I saw a hand raised.
You have a guard, you brought it that guard, contaminate, protect, contaminate the soil. Those plants absorb that contamination, you reset the vegetable,
You can get lead ingested. There are certain plants that will not absorb as much lead. And what little I know about gardening, urban gardening, there's a reason why they have raised beds in which they grow vegetables, because they're putting new soil in there. But uh, before the switch, it was recommended that filtered water be used to water even a backyard garden if you're going to use it for human consumption. We won't even talk about that. 'Cause Lead, lead works on a cellular level. There's two minerals that are important for cellular function, among others, but building blocks: calcium and iron. Lead mimics calcium and iron, and if you don't take in enough in your body, lead will take the place of those things. And so you are poisoning cells on a cellular level, not just an organ level. And lead stays in the brain for as long as a year. Lead stays in the teeth and the bones for decades. And so, say you're continually exposed to lead, you know, blood lead levels won't tell you anything. We are, the medical society and a few researchers are actually working on, can we get the equipment to measure the amount of lead in bones, especially for adults. For little kids, we can check their teeth uh, for the amount of lead. But then, what treatment do we have to eliminate that lead from the bones, the teeth, and the brain? And there are things called chelators. They're chemicals that bind lead and heavy metals so you can just pee it out. But the question is, if we reduce the amount of lead in the bone and reduce the body burden of lead, will we reduce the risk for things like heart attack, stroke, diabetes, uh, gout? So, yes, sir. Yes.
I wonder, is there any dietary practice, lead or over time? There some practices that help children and stuff. Nobody, you know, nothing against the thing of children, but nobody talks about it.
Well, diet with vitamin C because vitamin C promotes the absorption of iron, an iron-rich diet, and a diet rich in calcium. So that would be fruit, vegetables, uh, to a point, sardines if you can't drink milk, dairy products, uh, eggs. Those things are higher in calcium. So foods high in calcium, iron, and vitamin C. That would help. Okay, because it competes with the absorption of lead. But the bottom line is first eliminate lead from the built environment or the food source. There's no other way to do it. And that's why you may notice sometimes when certain physicians start talking this subject with other physicians or the legislature will say, look, we just have to stop using people as human bioassays for how bad the environment is, even as far as lead goes. So those are the foods. Yes. Hmm. Okay. Well, after we wrote our environmental justice recommendations, which was basically based on the 2009 environmental justice plan that was written under the Granholm administration, then watered down uh, by the Snyder administration and put on a shelf. We wrote 31 recommendations to address that, and you can find it online, the Environmental Justice Work Group recommendations. Some of them were watered down by our industry representatives. So if you really want to see something, look at the 2009 Environmental Justice Plan. My biggest frustration was how can you have recommendations without a plan? And the while we were working on our recommendations, the representatives of manufacturers and the energy industry went to the legislature through their lobbyists and proposed these legislations these laws that would undermine our key recommendations. That we have an interagency coordinating committee where health was primary and health was represented. That was among the state departments. That there was an environmental justice advisory council, which would advise this work group. That we have an ombudsman, ombudsperson, who citizens and residents could complain to if there was an issue. Okay, and I have to watch my language sometimes because I will talk about citizens under certain legal ramifications. But remember, we have residents who are our neighbors, and we have to be just as mindful of how things are affecting them as us. Okay, all of us. Yes. All right. Thank you, Father. So, the Environmental Justice Plan of 2009, the Environmental Justice Work Group, if you look at the states of New Jersey, New York, and I believe also California, you will see that they clearly define what an environmental justice community is. And that is a community that has more than 20% people of color and more than 30% uh, below the poverty line. Now, you see a pattern here? So we forced the governor staff to present the data that showed us these communities. And, it's pretty clear. Yes, there's areas where there's no people, a few people of color, like St. Louis, Michigan, but it was greater than 30% low income. And then there were places around the major cities that were both low income and greater than 20% minority. And And then we have to look at the issue of cumulative impact. And right now, California has one of the better scorecards for how you assess cumulative impact. And thirdly, having citizen scientists, citizens who have been brought up to speed based on their observations of the community and shown how to analyze and measure those things of concern to them. Those would be the three best answers or four best answers that I could give.
Medical society standpoint is incorrect. Took, it took studying of the average as the way to determine anything needed that the clusters, things like that, they sort of accumulate that problem. Running into the same problem. Numbers of those that are important to that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Getting called the cluster population.
Exposed from exposure to lead. That I have to say that's not in my specialty, but there are two people locally who are experts in that. One is Dr. Rick Sadler, who does geographic health and geography. He's the one who spotted out levels of high exposure in the city. Uh, Now understand that the Health and Human Services Department doesn't want us working on it, and they don't encourage. We're trying to get the equipment, the equipment called X-ray fluoroscopy, in order to at least assess how much lead is in the bodies of adult and senior citizen residents in place. And we've been working on it 2 years. I think we finally found one researcher who may be amenable to sharing her equipment. And it's not expensive equipment. It's only $65,000, but as a medical society, we pretty much exhausted our budget trying to push these things through so we can do those kind of assessments. Uh, and I see my time is up, but if I can say one more thing. Okay. How many people know that we have been in a hepatitis A outbreak in the southeastern part of Michigan since March 2017? Wow. Okay. And that in October 2017, October 31st, the Community Environmental Health Center was activated. That's the Health and Human Services, the State Health and Human Services Emergency Response Unit. And the State Emergency Center was activated to deal with this. And there have been over almost 900 cases, there have been 27 deaths, and almost 700 hospitalizations. This all started a year after the water shutoffs that happened in Detroit because people couldn't pay their bills. And so, just as they're starting to get this hepatitis A outbreak under control, if they're counting accurately, we are shutting off water again. In the city of Flint, we shut off 300 households a week. Maybe 150 of them get restored. So here we have another issue of health inequity, health disparity, environmental injustice. And so water, which should be a human right as defined by the United Nations, the cost of water, which should be no higher than 3% as defined by the United Nations, and here in Flint we're up at 7% minimum. Sometimes our water bills exceed our property tax bills. Water is becoming a commodity. So in other words, if you can't buy it, you can't get it. And then we get bottled water from Nestle in Flint to help us. Okay, Nestle pays $250 a year for the right to pump 400 gallons a minute of water and bottle it and sell it back to us in stores at a price more than the price of gasoline, even at $3 a gallon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Something's
yeah,
wrong
that's
with
true.
that.
Dr. Reynolds, what about the effect of drinking plastic bottled water for all that period of time?
Oh, that's a whole nother issue. If certain plastic bottles get warm, they release the chemical, and I can't remember the name of it. So ideally, we should be using something that's made of metal or only certain types of plastic to consume water. So the same thing happens in certain baby bottles. Don't get me started on talking about dollar stores. The Dollar General and the dollar stores, because of NAFTA, the trade treaty, ex- we can import things that don't meet U.S. safety standards. And they have had studies, and if you want to do something with your students, if you could get a little fluoroscope and go through the dollar stores and touch that sensor to various items that they sell there, you will find there are many items that are contaminated by lead, and I can't speak to the other chemicals or things there. So I thank you all for your attention, and